So again, welcome to everyone, wherever you are. We're very, very happy to offer you the sixth of 6 events in the Lyceum series. I am Elizabeth Lee. I'm the Director of Education and Interpretation at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and also a Whallonsburg Grange board member. I'm joined by Andy Buchanan, who is one of the, I would say, most dedicated board members the Grange has had. And, has been a member of every committee and probably attended every event. I'm not sure, but welcome, Andy. He'll be working in the background too to help troubleshoot if we have problems. For those of you who don't know, or this is your first time joining a Grange event, the Grange is truly an amazing community center. We eat, drink, and are merry. We also build things, feed people, and exchange a lot of great ideas. We have a film series as well as the many events and many projects where we welcome lots of volunteers. The Lyceum series has been offered for 10 years in person, and this is the first year virtually. Tonight is, as I say, the 6th of 6 events, and I encourage all of you who if you've missed an event in the series, you can go to our YouTube channel and see recordings of the entire series, as well as some previous Grange events. The series is supported by the contributions of many volunteers and donors. And tonight I specifically want to thank the Glenn and Carol Pearsall Adirondack Foundation for funding this transition from the in-person to the virtual format, which is really greatly appreciated and seen an incredible result with so many people from literally coast to coast being able to participate. So thank you so much to them. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Curt Stager, who is an author, a researcher, and a professor at Paul Smith College. And I might also point out, a scientist. And we're really grateful for your participation in the Lyceum series, Curt. And I'll let you introduce yourself, or give any more information about yourself. So thank you and welcome. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off the video for Andy, Mia, and Curt. Go ahead and you can share your screen.
All right.
Just say one more thing. So sorry, I forgot. I mentioned it too. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to the Wild Center's Youth Climate Program. They are simultaneously hosting a Youth Half Power event. It's very, very encouraging. They are talking about justice, equity, and the climate crisis, a group of incredible young leaders. And I just really want to recognize that that event is happening simultaneously. It's just amazing and great news that we're at that point in the conversation where the young people are spinning off into their own very, very strong participation in the problem solving on this issue and leadership. So I just wanted to give them a shout out, and I'll let Curt talk more. So go ahead and share your screen, Curt.
Okay, and thank you so much for Elizabeth and Andy and everybody else at the Grange for keeping this going, and of course just having the Grange in the first place. It's an amazing community and a great contribution to the North End. So yeah, and so tonight I would just like to give some updates on climate change in the Adirondacks from various sources. I promise it won't be totally doom and gloom, but it's a serious thing, and the story's just going to be, updated through our lifetimes, basically. And there are some things we can do to get involved in this issue, including with young folks. Things like the Youth Climate Summit is just a fantastic thing to support, but there are other smaller scale local things we can do too. So I'll open up the PowerPoint and we'll just get going, and then we'll have some question and answer afterwards. So I'm going to stop share and find it first. I was looking at it. Oh, I see. Yeah, I've got to reopen the PowerPoint somehow. I think it got closed somehow. You can watch what I've got here. There we go. Okay. That's the great thing about this COVID crisis. People have gotten more patient with each other's glitches. This is good. All right. So yeah. I won't belabor the point that climate change is real and mostly due to us right now. I want to focus on the other part of it, which is that it's not just some distant thing, but it's happening right here where we live. And I want to give you some evidence of this. For starters, I'll be talking about, what do the weather data say and things like that, but then focus on some of the effects and what does it mean as this continues to unfold into the future for people like us who live around here in the North Country. So as far as the actual measurements of temperature and things like that go, we've got half a dozen reputable full-time weather stations scattered through the Adirondacks. I put little stars on there. The data are carefully archived, and you can find them online and analyze them. What I'll be showing you tonight is numbers that are have been worked on as a senior project by Skylar Murphy at Paul Smith's College, where I teach. So I'll be using some of her findings there for you to give you an update of what temperatures are doing around here. So this is just the Lake Placid station, which is pretty similar to the other stations. Here's one of the graphs. It's the last more than 100 years now. So if you read it from left to right, you got 1900 up to basically the present day, and there's an upswing overall, which you would expect if it's getting warmer. But I'm going to focus on the time since about 1970 or so for these findings here, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that around 1970 is when the human influence on global climate really started to separate off from the other factors like solar variability, volcanoes, things like that. Some of the ups and downs before were a combination of us and those other forces. This increase, though, since about 1970, basically half a century, we can be pretty sure is mostly due to our emissions of heat trapping fossil fuel burning gases, mainly carbon dioxide. So since about 1970, overall, in spite of the ups and downs, we've got about a 2 degree or so or more, depending on how you run the curve there. Several degrees warming anyway. Skylar teased this out by season. And in this last 50 years, the biggest warming has been happening in winter. So we have this bar chart here. I've got the months numbered 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. That'd be January would be 1 and 12 would be December. And there's a bar here for the amount of warming in degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. The two biggest bars are in January and December's. Interestingly, February doesn't have much of a significant warming at all in the numbers we looked at. But that's where the biggest change is. So if you look at that big picture, what we're essentially doing is taking what you might have thought of as an Adirondack year with two basic seasons, the warm season and the snow season. And I made that in the shape of boxes here on the left, summer and winter there. As we warm up, and especially with winter warming most, what we're ending up with is longer, hotter summers and shorter, milder winters. That's the overall theme of what I'll be talking about tonight. What does this mean on the ground for us here? Not just in a physical sense, but also in a cultural sense, in our sense of identity. So here's some not all that recent analysis. This came out of Jerry Jenkins's book that came out some years ago. He did beautiful artwork of this. But part of what's going to be unfolding here where we live depends on us as a species around the world. For computers to tell us what the future holds, just in this century alone, it's going to depend on how we run our civilization. Are we going to switch quickly from fossil fuels to less climatically impacted forms of energy? Or are we just going to continue kind of as we are and basically burn it all till we run out and put it all into the atmosphere? So these are two scenarios here with basically one way to look at it is here's the state of New York on the left, and the darker the blue blob is basically where we are, the more winter there is, the more snow cover. And as the colors get paler, there's less and less winter, you could say. And so we've got two options here for the rest of the century. By the end of the century, if we switch quickly and cut our emissions, we'll have some winter left and very little left if we don't. So that's the biggest source of uncertainty right now. But what we can count on, or expect anyway, is a shrinkage of snow cover during the course of winter. This fits with some work I did with Mary Thill about 10 years ago as well. We did this document. It's free online. You can Google it, climate change in the Champlain Basin. And we ran 16 climate models that focused just on this region, the Champlain Basin, and got the same result. If we have moderate emissions in this century, it'll get somewhat slightly warmer, mostly in winter and summer. If we go ahead and burn as much as we can, like we've been doing so far, we'll get maybe twice as much warming, mostly in winter. So you might have heard people say, well, in the long term, what we're basically doing is turning the Adirondacks into the Blue Ridge. Okay, so, we're up here where you get a full-blown winter up in the mountains. Okay, down here, the Blue Ridge, they do get some snow, but not very much. And so, what does that mean? And at first, when I heard that years ago, I thought, well, I used to live down near the Blue Ridge. It's gorgeous. And you even have autumn colors and things. People love it down there, right? So, what would be so terrible about making the Adirondacks look like that? Well, think about it some more, and talking to local folks here. I talked to Chuck Bruja down at the Mountaineer, let's say, down in Keene Valley. And I brought it up with him and said, like, what do you all think? You're in the winter sports industry. And what does it mean to be losing winter? And he said, where we live defines who we are. And winter defines the North Country. And that really opened up my eyes to that. Like, okay, that is what's one of the things that's different from the Blue Ridge and makes me prefer to live here. And a lot of our cultural identity really does come from that. So it's like here, Lake Placid. You ever tell somebody you live up in the Adirondacks or upstate New York, they think, yeah, if you say, if I live in New York, they think you're in Manhattan. Then you say, no, upstate. And they'll say, oh, Schenectady. No. Then, oh, up where the Olympics were. Oh, yeah, Lake Placid. And we've had 2 Winter Olympic Games. That really has defined for a lot of people what Lake Placid is. So we've got the Olympic heritage, we've got the Winter Carnival in Saranac Lake that's been going for over a century, and the Ice Palace and things like that. We've got Whiteface and ski areas, snowmobiling, all these kinds of things, which help us to define ourselves as residents of the North Country, having this winter here. There are other economic as well as cultural things besides the winter sports. Things I picked up from local folks, including forestry people at Paul Smith's College where I work, things I hadn't even thought of, right? So here's a photo from the 1800s of people logging, horse logging in the woods in the Adirondacks in the winter. Okay, well, yeah, so what's that got to do with now? If you don't have the frozen ground and the snow and ice in the winter, it's hard to haul things out of the woods. It looks more like this. So I heard concern from people that work in the woods of saying, the shorter a season we get of hard frozen ground, the less time we have to get our stuff out of the woods. So that was an interesting, eye-opening thing. Just looking at the cultural effects of winter on life in the North Country for all sorts of people. There are things you can see for yourself as well about this change. And for me, one of the most entertaining ways of finding this out is local ice out contests. We've had one at Paul Smith's College going on since 1970. It's actually not so much a contest anymore. I've taken it over in recent years and I built it into one of our classes, a climate change monitoring class. But one of the great things is towns will watch their local lake, especially in the spring when people are eager for winter to be over. And they'll keep careful track of the date when the ice goes out. Maybe they'll put some object out on a piece of furniture or something out on the ice. And then when that falls through into the water, you mark that as ice out in the spring and you gamble on it like a sporting event. So when there's money around deciding on it, people are very methodical and careful about this, and they keep records. So that way people can look, when I'm going to put my money down on what date the ice is going to go out, I want to know what happened last year and the year before so I can judge better. So there are these records all over the North Country. In the case of Lower St. Regis Lake, we've got later freeze ups, a little more than a week, almost 2 weeks later on average. It varies from year to year. And ice is leaving earlier, not as extreme, as fast a change, but also a little more than a week since about 1970. So you can see this for yourself on the ice where you live. Lake Champlain, I think that's one of the most spectacular data sets, if you can call data sets spectacular, being a scientist here, right? There's a 200-year record of when the main basin of Lake Champlain froze up. Not so much from ice out contests, but just from general observations and official observations and things. So I made a timeline here to sort of illustrate this. It reads from left to right, the early 1800s, all the way up to about the present day. You get all these data online too. I put a little asterisk for every winter where the main basin of Lake Champlain between Burlington and Plattsburgh didn't freeze completely. And if you read through the 1800s, you get a couple of them, and then that's basically it. And then as the 1900s go on, you get more and more and more of these winters where it didn't freeze over completely, until nowadays, it's the opposite situation. It's normal for the main basin of Lake Champlain not to freeze. Well, that's a pretty clear indication of warming in the region, and it fits the weather records. So one of the practical implications of this is recreation on the lake. I remember when I first moved up here in the 1980s, there were always like big shanty towns of ice fishers out on the lake. And I remember in the spring, sometimes it was sort of funny because there'd always be some people who left their shanty on the ice too long in the spring, and a big chunk of ice would break off with shanties and people on it, and they'd all have to be rescued. And there was a big fuss in the media about it. That doesn't happen anymore out in the open waters of the main basin of Lake Champlain. So you can ask around. I mean, one of the interesting things is you can read about climate change, global climate change, and you kind of got to listen to experts about this, right? But the local stories are things that we're the experts on, and people you might never expect being experts on the impacts of these changes. So one of the people I've spoken to is Russell Fox. He works for the ferry service there on Lake Champlain some years ago, and I asked him about this, and I said, what's it like for you ferry operators having less ice there in the main basin in the winter? And I expected him to say it was better because you don't have to break the ice to get through. And he said, no, we don't like it. And that's because if you don't have the ice, then you're vulnerable to the wind. And if you have a winter storm, you get massive waves, and it's spraying everywhere and freezing on the cars, and the boats are rocking. It's a nice quiet ride when the lake is frozen. And the other thing I thought was really amazing too, he said, if you're an experienced ferry operator, you also notice the nature of the waves. In the winter, the water is colder, and so that makes it denser. The molecules pull closer together. So when a big wave hits your boat in winter, it really slams, and the boat operators can feel the difference. So that was kind of eye-opening there. You spend less fuel breaking ice, but now you've got these rougher rides in the winter. So these stories, are built around these facts that the climate is warming here, especially in winter. We'll have spin-off stories. Some of them we'll find depressing. Some of them we'll think less so, because we're a complicated, culture and ecosystem here. If you change it like we're doing, some aspects may benefit and some will be harmed. And again, we are the experts on this because we know the place. So one of the things you might think of as well, here's deer hunting, right? One of the biggest killers of deer in the North Country besides people is winter. So if it's a harsh winter, a lot of deer don't make it. So milder winters could actually mean more deer, which could be good news for someone who likes to hunt deer. But of course, you can look at another aspect of it and say, well, that's also for deer ticks. And they like it too. So the more deer, the more deer ticks as well. And they carry, of course, Lyme disease and Powassan virus and all these other wonderful things. So, and on that positive note, I had a student and a colleague at Paul Smith's College, Leanne Sporn had a student. And basically, she does a lot of research on Lyme disease and the spread of it into the North Country. And got the student to do a nice GIS, geographical information study project here, and made a map of elevation and temperature in the Adirondacks. And keeping in mind what conditions deer ticks prefer. And on the left side is New York State, and we're here in blue, the upper uplands of the Adirondacks. That means it's kind of too cool for what ticks like, whereas you all down in the valley there, you're just prime for deer ticks. If you use the climate models we've got for what we expect for warming in the future in that range, this is using the extreme emission scenario. The whole, pretty much all of the main parts of the uplands will become suitable habitats for deer ticks too. So yeah, if you enjoyed walking out in the high peaks and not having to worry as much about ticks, enjoy it while you can. So there are other stories here too, right? Some people like winter, some people don't. There are positive and negative aspects of it. Okay, so the upper picture here is road salt, right? That's a big problem. It contaminates lakes and wells and things like that. It corrodes cars. Shorter winter could mean less road salt application, you know, if we don't stop it for other reasons as well. And, you know, better driving conditions in some ways. But on the other hand, I've spoken with snowplow drivers in some of our local towns, and they all agree that if you have a winter without a lot of snow, it really hurts them economically because they don't get as much work. And not only that, if they are not making the extra money from snow plowing people's driveways and things like that, there's less money circulating in our local communities as well, because they don't have the extra cash to be spending on meals and extra things like that. So it has cascading economic impacts as well. So again, it's not a simplistic doom and gloom or everything's fine, it's all fake. It's a complicated story. I think we're the best qualified to really take serious looks at what does this mean and how do we prepare for this to happen. So sort of put a brighter spin on it, you know, we've got changing growing conditions for crops around here. It's getting better, I'm told, by people who grow grapes around here for wineries and things. So if you like wine and grapes, maybe that's good news for you to have this kind of thing going on. And we've got that wine trail now developing up in the North Country. So the mix. All right. So having shorter, milder winters goes hand in hand with longer, hotter summers. So there are two sides of a coin here. You say the end of winter and the endless summer kicking up here. So let's take a quick look at the summer thing. What does that mean? Again, these are Schuyler's analyses. Here again are the different temperatures. I've highlighted here with the green numbers, the warming in summer. So there's definitely warming going on, just not as extreme as in the winter. So we can ask, like, what does that do? Well, one thing is it warms the lakes, and different kinds of fish and other organisms too prefer different temperatures. So if you're warming the surface of a lake, it's not so good for trout. They have trouble breeding. They have trouble getting enough oxygen. They overheat. Whereas other fish have an advantage, you know, the pike and the bass, you call them warm water fish. But then it can get even more complicated than this. Here's a situation. This is Whallonsburg Pond outside of Tupper Lake, now owned by the Nature Conservancy. This is where Ralph Waldo Emerson and a bunch of friends had their philosophers camp expedition in the 1800s. This is being considered to be managed by the Nature Conservancy as a climate refuge for lake trout. It's got a wonderfully intact, abundant community of lake trout that live in the deep waters of this lake. It's over 100 feet deep. And so even in a warm summer, there's plenty of deep, cold water with plenty of oxygen and the right temperatures to resist that kind of a change. So in other lakes around here, we're losing lake trout for various reasons, including the warming. And that goes for brook trout too. In this case, it's encouraging people who are responsible for certain ecosystems to look into the future, realize it's going to be warming, and see the special value in places like Whallonsburg Pond. Because it's so deep, it's going to resist the effects of those changes longer than other lakes and basically make it a lake trout climate refuge. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about precipitation. Short version of it is it's also gotten somewhat wetter as well over this time period, and that fits the global models as well. Here, while it's getting drier in the Southwest, we're getting wetter over here. You can see this for yourself. Here's Bear Pond near Paul Smith, several lakes away. Here on the left is a tree. Trees don't normally sprout in the water. This used to be an island, and there was a no camping sign here put by the DEC back in the 80s. I confess I camped there illegally and also got busted by a ranger for doing that. You don't do it anymore because it's underwater. Looking over here, if you go to a lot of the Adirondack lakes, you'll see things like this where the roots are partly submerged along the shoreline. This is Bear Pond also. Plants do not take root. I mean, trees don't take root underwater. That means the water has come up since the trees sprouted. So you can see the effects of this higher rainfall. Level of Lake Champlain has also risen on average. There's there are surface level gauges around the lake that show that. There are other changes too that go with this. If you get not only wetter, but warmer as well, but especially wetter, you change what the lakes look like. So here was a picture I took at Bear Pond back in the 80s. It was famously clear, almost like a swimming pool. You go there today, it looks more like this on the right. That's partly because of the acid rain story. We had federal legislation, updated the Clean Air Act and enforced it, and has greatly reduced acid rain in the Northeast. It's a wonderful success story. The flip side of that is, okay, now plankton grows in the lake, so it's not as clear. But there's another thing going on too. It's called browning. And that's because when it's warmer and wetter, you basically turn the leaf litter and duff and the forest floor around a lake into tea, like a tea bag. And if you put the water in it, you soak the brown tea staining tannins and things out of it and wash them into the lake. And that's happening with lakes all across North America, the Northern Hemisphere, where it's been getting wetter as well. So that changes the ecology of the lake and the physical appearance. That's related to climate. And another thing is, if you look at the intensity of our rainstorms, that is actually going up here as well as around the world. You look at daily rainfall records. This one's from Dannemora. I just did a graph of the last 100 years, put a little blue dot for every storm that dropped more than 2 inches of rain in a day. If you read from left to right over time, the intensity of those intense storms has increased over time, just like you expect in a warming climate. And some of you may remember the Irene flooding here. This is in the town of Keene, people's backyards and homes destroyed by that. So, start turning the corner here. What comes next? What do we do about this, right? Well, there are things globally that have to happen, but there are also things locally as well. Bottom line is to, first of all, face what's going on. And that's, unfortunately, as we all know, a cultural challenge right now, where people deny science and facts and facing what's going on. But one of my favorite quotes is from Thomas Henry Huxley, a biologist in the 1800s. He summed this situation up and he said, you have to learn what is true in order to do what is right. And with some work and care, you can find out the facts, right? And that helps us decide what to do. other thing though is some of this stuff is not published, especially the local things. And as I've said several times, we are the local experts on what's going on around where we live, and we can observe and record and share our observations of the world around us, whether it's, the animals and plants or the culture, the economics, any of these things. We've got people in schools doing work that could be harnessed, or just people's nature diaries or groups. So I want to encourage people to either begin keeping observations, if that's something you like to do, a nature diary, watching when the flowers come out in spring, let's say, or anything at all. Or if you've got this kind of thing already, just keep doing it. I want to encourage you, because this stuff's really important. We are the only folks writing this stuff down. And we may think, who's ever going to care about this, right? It's just my little diary, and it's also normal. Why would anybody care about this? Well, it's not going to be normal decades from now. So these things that you make are references for people in the future to measure the changes as they're going on. And I have, like, one of my favorite examples is this one. It's when Samuel de Champlain came to the North Country for the first time in early 1600s, and indigenous folks are paddling him down the lake and Lake Champlain. And so he's just taking copious notes in his diary, and he has no idea what's going to be an important observation. So he writes it all down, the animals and plants and the people and the terrain and things. And sure enough, here's an entry here from his diary. You translate it into English. It says, "I noticed while observing the country some very high mountains on the eastern side, on top of which there was snow." So if you're paddling down Lake Champlain and you look to high mountains on the east, that would of course be the Green Mountains. And he described them being covered with snow. What I find fascinating is he did this in July 1609. So that's a pretty big change, right? We sometimes get snow in the summer, right? But the chances of him having been there for a freak snowstorm, I think, is pretty low. So here, unbeknownst to him, he made a stake in the ground for measuring climate change in the region. This was a much cooler time when he was there than what we've got now. And what we're in now is a cooler time than what's coming. So if you don't feel like keeping a nature diary, but you're still interested in the topic, well, other people are. And maybe you could dig some of them up and share them with people. I mean, I love collecting these. If you know of any of these, send them to me. I'll archive them for you and give students the chance to analyze them and things. This is Pete McConville in Paul Smith's. He's a caretaker on one of the Upper St. Regis Lake. When he took over, he found this stuff written on the wall of one of the tool sheds by former caretakers. And he brought me in and showed me. And these are ice out dates on the lake from written down by former caretakers going back decades. So there's an ice climate record on the wall of the tool shed at caretaker's place. We have schools that are looking for science projects and things. Why don't you look at what's going on around you outside the building, right? Study the natural world. So we've made a thing we call a phenology trail at Paul Smith's College. Phenology is the study of animals and plants doing what they do according to the seasons. And so if the seasons are changing or the climate is changing, their behaviors and appearances and things will change too. That's phenology. I've built this into a class where students monitor. We make a map around the campus and they monitor things like, when do the robins come back? And here's where you observe that. Or here's the standard spot for red maples. When do they open up in the spring? When do the salamanders migrate? When do the bees come out of the ground over here? When do the trilliums open up? All those kinds of things. And you just keep the record. And it's fun because it tells you when, winter's over, spring's coming. One of the most interesting things with the students is we've been doing this, we've got data going back to 1990. And we're finding that some things are changing and some things are not. The robins are coming back earlier. The redwings are not. The salamanders are migrating earlier. The red maples are not opening earlier. So some things are changing, some are not. And that was a big surprise because we know the North Country is warming. So what's going on with that? We're also concerned, of course, if some things change and others don't, there could be ecological mismatches between predators and prey and pollinators and plants and things. We don't have clear evidence of that yet. But what's going on here? Like, how can this be? Why aren't the maples changing? So one of the mysteries about this is what's happening with spring. And again, here's that bar chart of the different months and the different amounts of warming. And here I put in spring in the yellow numbers. There's very little change in most of the spring months, and then a slight one in May, basically. So that helps to explain why there's very mixed results for the animals and plants in the spring, which is unfortunate, actually, because most nature diaries people keep are in the spring. When do the flowers open up? I'm so happy to see them. And when are the birds? I'm so happy to see them coming back, you know. But that's when the least change is happening. So we may not see a lot of difference happening as much as in the other parts of the year. So at Paul Smith College, we're also trying to focus on other times of year as well for our nature diaries. And it turns out autumn has the second largest warmings, especially in September and somewhat in October as well. So almost as much as the winter. So basically there's your endless summer forming, right? Instead of, you know, losing summer in August and then suddenly cold, it's like going on and on. Well, it turns out, which is again an encouragement for people involved with formal classes, high schools, colleges, whatever. At Paul Smith College, we do a lot of hands-on outdoors experiential education. And just because of that style, when I designed the biology labs, I had students go out and collect plankton from the lake on campus, starting, you know, in the 80s and early 90s, and also taking the water temperature. And we've been doing that ever since. And sure enough, just like the September air temperatures, see the surface of the lake warming up. It used to be in the around 13 degrees in September. Now it's closer to 18 centigrade. Those are big changes, and those have ecological effects on the lake as well. So this is built right into a biology class. You don't need a grant for it or anything like that. And pretty convincing evidence right there of what's happening to our lakes. So to close here, you know, these kinds of stories can be depressing and can lead to despair for a lot of folks. I want to encourage you not to despair. One thing you might ask yourself is, you know, like, what can I do? Okay, I saved a little carbon here tonight by not driving to the Grange. We're doing the Zoom thing, right? Okay, well, or if I change a light bulb, what's that going to do? Okay, so yes, your small action may not alter the entire planet, but it does change you. It's a way for you to be mindful of the situation we're in and our place in the world today as a force of nature, as human beings. And it also helps you feel, I think, that you're living your life in a more meaningful way to do these small things because you're engaged with the big stories of our time. But there's another practical thing too, and that's that you have a sphere of influence. People around you notice what you do and what you say, even if they don't let you know you influence people. And so the way you live your life and setting these examples also spreads beyond you. And that's really important nowadays when human beings are such a force of nature. And I think one of the wonderful examples of this is situations like this at Paul Smith College again, where we try to talk to people that we don't normally talk to. Local folks, all of whom love the Adirondacks, but are on different sides of, let's say, the political spectrum or the class spectrum and the cultural divide. These are students from a climate communication class I taught some years ago who wanted to talk to people at the Fish and Game Club in St. Regis Falls, which had a reputation for, let's just say, not being full of wild-eyed climate activists. A lot of people who would say, you know, it's all made up by Al Gore and things like that. So with great respect, the students went over and introduced themselves, said, would you like a presentation on climate? If so, what topics would you like to do? We'd be glad to come and answer any questions you may have. The Fish and Game Club people were game, so to speak, and they said, we want to know about deer and trout. Students researched what we know about climate change in the Adirondacks and the effects on that. They came and gave a talk, and the place was packed. And afterwards, the people stayed around for an hour talking to the students. We can do this again, and I really encourage us to avoid the demonization we've been doing back and forth with red state, blue state election stuff. We're all Adirondackers, we're all Americans. We're all seeing these changes happen. We may not call them climate change, but we're all seeing it. So I think this is a great opportunity to make a tighter community as well. Stand up for science, look for alternative energy. Above all, you can vote. You can go out and march. You can support young people like the Youth Climate Summit, which began here in the North Country at Tupper Lake at the Wild Center and has now spread across the country and around the world. Incredibly inspiring youth activism and engagement as a positive force for good. So there's a lot you can do, or a lot you can be heartened by, but above all, let's be witnesses of what's really going on here so we know what's true here. That'll help us do a better job of doing what's right. And I will leave it at that. And I'll stop sharing, and I guess we'll open up for questions and answers. If Elizabeth
That's great. Yeah.
Moderate that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Curt. Such an interesting presentation. We do have a couple questions. And the first one is from Chantel. Hi, Chantel. Great to have you tonight. Do you know of any local citizen science groups that people could contribute to? Is her question.
I am not that up on that. I focus on Paul Smith College, but if somebody in the group knows of some, I think that'd be wonderful. And maybe you could put that in the question and answer places we could.
Yep, or go ahead and put it in the chat box. That's fine. The other thing I can say is I do know a number of different citizen science efforts. If you are familiar with the phone app iNaturalist, there's a lot of great projects that focus on the Adirondacks, everything from Adirondack, like orchids in the Adirondacks to, there's a lot of great also birding opportunities to keep track of birds, and specifically the backyard bird count and the Christmas bird count are both great ways to get involved, and glad to give people more information about that. Okay, the question.
There is a group, maybe someone would know who the contact people are, but I do know there's a group, I think they're based out of Lake Placid, who monitor butterfly populations. There is also a bird monitoring. State actually helps run some of that as well.
And there are also a couple of still groups that I think are still active doing wildlife tracking and monitoring mammals during 4 different windows during the year. Okay, we still have questions coming in. So let's see, looks like, oh yeah, there's a couple other one. Kokoras has been mentioned in the chat too. That's for recording weather data and climate weather data particularly. And lots of people throwing info in the chat. If you don't have the answer yet from the chat, keep talking to us, and we'll try and get you some more information.
I'll chime in here actually. It's kind of easy to have your own weather station and things like that. We've got weather stations. But if you do want to measure weather, one of the things that doesn't get measured so much is thunderstorms. Like when you hear thunder and you get lightning, stuff like that. You can have things that'll measure the amount of rainfall, but thunderstorms have strong winds that blow things down. They got lightning that can light fires and stuff like that. It's an important thing. And I realized that because we were donated, someone donated a diary of somebody who had daily records of everything you can imagine from Cranberry Lake over decades, daily, like several times a day, including all the weather stuff. But he also wrote down every time he heard thunder. And you could watch the increase in thunderstorms happening over that time period. And that's not normally in the weather stations. But I would encourage you to do other things besides weather. Like, what are the plants doing? What are the animals doing? What's the ice doing? And stuff in the lakes, right? They're being influenced as it warms. So, or what, how do people live differently? What are we doing with our spare time? How's it affecting any of this stuff that we take for granted now as normal is going to be changing. And that's stuff that's not going to show up in a weather station.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. It looks like another question was from Mary Nell. Are you observing adaptation in fauna or flora to the modest climate changes in the Adirondacks so far? Or do you have thoughts about how adaptation to climate change has happened historically?
Yeah. Most of the species that we've got around here now are widespread. So that means as a species, they're able to handle a wide range of climatic conditions, different, raccoons, right? Or white-tailed deer. So a lot of them, you're not going to see a gigantic change as far as, well, actually, you may. Okay, so now that I'm thinking about it, I had lunch with some of the maintenance fellas at Paul Smith's. They, again, are what you might call climate denier types. I didn't bring up the topic. They were talking in the fall about the deer hunt. They were all excited for that to happen. And they were talking among themselves, and I was part of it. And they were saying, yeah, the deer rut is coming later every year. I think we should talk to the DEC to push the hunting season. So the behaviors are things you could see, right? And like the robins, they're coming earlier. But then you really got to know your critters, right? The robins are coming back earlier and the redwings are not. What's that all about? So yeah, the phenology thing is a way to see those adaptations, but they're behavioral adaptations, not evolutionary.
Let's see, thanks.
So there's a couple of questions there.
Yeah,
on
there's a comment here from Corey who says SUNY ESF and DEC have a website to map invasive species that's open to the public. It's actually called IMAP Invasives, and says, do you know of other websites that can help track observations like the ones you mentioned about monitoring climate seasonal changes?
Yeah, there are some phenology. If you Google search phenology studies and things like that, there are several around the country that do kind of like what we're doing at Paul Smith's, but they do it on a larger scale. Like Project Budburst is one of them. Things like that will monitor the advance of spring through the country from south to north and things like that. And the data that get input to that are archived as well.
Many of those are designed for teachers as well, for teachers to do with classes. So if you look for those kinds of tools or do a little Google searching for the kinds of citizen science classroom activities, you'll find places where they are recording and aggregating personal and citizen data. Yeah. Lots of other questions here. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact of browning on lakes?
Yeah. So as you put this organic matter into the lakes, there are several possible implications. One of them is the brown stuff could be made of a wide range of substances. Some of it can be nutritious for plankton, for algae, and so you might get more algae growth. Flip side of that is, as you darken the waters, you reduce the light penetration. And so life that was living on the bottom, such as algae or plants or whatever, could not get enough sunlight and be shaded out. Depending on what your ecosystem is doing at the time, that can be considered a positive or a negative thing. I'll just give one example. We also do work on Walden Pond over in Massachusetts, Henry David Thoreau's Walden Pond, and students and I go there and we're studying the ecology and the changes. That's a very clear water lake and it's got a lot of plant type growth on the bottom. That's a good thing because human waste is getting into the lake from people swimming in it, and that could make algae blooms, be toxic. Well, fortunately, the plants are pulling that nutrition away from a lot of the algae. So if Walden Pond ever had browning, which it doesn't have yet at least, you could shade out those plants on the bottom. There'd be nothing to protect the lake from the algae blooms and it'd start to go. So it's going to be a case by case thing for the lakes. The other thing is having the darkness absorb more of the sun's heat in the upper layers. And so you stratify the lake and you can lose oxygen down below. That's bad for trout.
We have a lot of interest in the question from Andy McKinley. How has the running of sap in the maple syrup industry been impacted by the warming winters?
I was going to ask the group that. I've been hoping for a long-term, consistent data set on that. I have not gotten one yet from local folks, but talking to folks in Maple, and if anybody in the group here knows more about it than I, and that'd be easy to find. As far as I've heard, the timing can switch year to year, of course, depending on whether you get, the cold nights, warm mornings, and things like that. But as far as I know, there is no overall trend of overall production changing. It's the timing of the whole thing seems to be shifting a little, but that shouldn't be surprising, right? Because the warming is not that strong in the spring. So I wouldn't expect to see a gigantic shift, but I don't have the data. So if anybody here in the group knows of any definitive study in that regard, set me straight on that. But as far as I know, maple is not being heavily hit yet.
Thank you. Another question from Frank. Could you discuss the impact of heating with wood versus alternatives?
You mean as far as global warming, I imagine?
Impact, yeah.
Yeah, so the thing about if you burn renewable carbon sources like wood, basically it goes into the air and gets sucked in by plants again. The difference with the fossil fuels, that used to be plants too, right? But they were buried and they were out of the system. So what we're doing is taking long buried carbon and adding it to that cycle that you would do with wood. So yes, you would have less of a net impact globally if you burned with wood, but of course there are other problems with wood, right? It's got particulates, it's got toxins in that tarry substance that's in there too, so it can reduce air quality. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, but as far as carbon emissions, you're basically you're just participating in the typical recycling of carbon in the ecosystem. That's different from burning fossil fuels.
Thank you. A question from Tori. Doesn't the Adirondack ecosystems and working lands farms provide huge opportunity for enhancing carbon drawdown through conservation of natural lands, afforestation, including riparian restoration, and land and soil management?
Yeah, absolutely. This global issue of buildup of fossil fuel emissions is gigantic, and we need all of the contributions we can. So yes, if you have undeveloped land, you can pull carbon out of the air, right? However, if you have a forest, a lot of the carbon's already sitting here, so it doesn't pull that much out compared to what we're putting into the air. The fossil fuel emission effects are swamping all of these kinds of things. Sometimes we say, well, agriculture, that's a gigantic contributor, right? Yeah, well, especially if you add in things like the fossil fuels involved in having agriculture, right? The transport, the fertilizer, the manufacturing, all that kind of stuff. It boils down to burning coal, oil, and gas. And to have the big changes, that's what we got to focus on as a planet to get rid of. Meanwhile, as far as learning what is true so we can do what is right, we can all contribute our little bits by things such as letting natural areas stay natural or return to the vegetative state because they'll pull carbon out of the air.
Thank you for that one. It looks like there's a comment from Tricia that says Cornell has had a maple study going on for many years in Lake Placid. That's probably Mike Farrell's.
Yeah, Mike Farrell. Yeah.
Program.
Mike was my source on that comment, and he was reassuring me, by the way, that if we do become the Blue Ridge, there's an active sugaring industry down on the Blue Ridge too.
Okay, another question. It looks like from Colin Powers. Can you talk about how extreme weather events, i.e. Irene style, may affect the sustainability of small towns and villages in the Adirondacks?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one, right? For those of us that lived through that and then toured the aftermath, going up and down the Ausable Valley and watching what it did to communities. I mean, we've got all kinds of problems. Like having a single road into your area that runs along the floor of the valley, which is a floodplain. And you can tell that, right? And you get the road cut and you look and it's full of cobbles and boulders. That's because the river put it there under the road. And that's why it's so flat, right? So when you have these extreme events, you're trapped. And so that kind of long-term planning is a good thing to do, even if we didn't have global warming, because floods always happen. You can see it in the floodplain, right? The problem, of course, is who's going to pay for all this, or where's the land going to come from? And so these are complicated situations. And the folks who are responsible for our towns, not just first responders, but like mayors and town planners and things, had to really think outside the box when we had Irene down there and realize how complicated these problems are. So some of the things we're trying to do, some people are trying to do is, put larger culverts now, regulations for culverts under roads, because the floods are going to be bigger and stuff like that. But the problem is going to be the finances and cooperation among everybody involved. And again, I want to come back to this with our polarized social media bubbles, demonizing people outside of our bubbles. That really makes all of these things much harder when we really need to pull together as a species and as a country and a world to solve these complicated problems.
I think many of us would agree with that. Okay, we have a couple more questions. Is there any expected USDA planting zoning changes?
I've been told by master gardener types that they've already changed, haven't they? Someone in the group may know about this. They're different from several years ago already. And of course, this warming, no matter what we do, is going to increase for the rest of the century and centuries into the future. So yes, the hardiness zones are absolutely going to change. It's just a question of how fast and how much.
This is another question from Chantel. This is a personal observation, but the summers seem to be drier and drier rather than wetter. Is there any data seeing this as a possible trend? Speaking as a member of the farming community.
Yeah. I think when I looked at Skylar's project, there was not a clear trend over the last 50 years for the summer rainfall. It was very confusing. There's an overall increase, but there's no particular season when it's happening. It's spread through the year. So I think the only thing you can say is regardless, and the models, by the way, are contradictory as well, what will be coming. Although most of them say if we have the extreme warming, it should get somewhat wetter. But that's an average. I think what we're more likely to expect is that you're going to have both things happening. You may have some change in the precip. You're going to have it warmer. Well, that evaporates more. So you could have droughts without changing the precipitation. If you warm the summers up, or you extend them deep into September, let's say, as well, we could get drops in groundwater levels just from the evaporation alone. So droughtiness in terms of agriculture, I think, is not necessarily correlated directly to the precipitation amount in this case. The other thing is, as I was showing with that extreme event slide, the town of Keene in there, that is a definite trend. The heavy rainfall events that we would always be getting are becoming heavier. So what used to be considered a wicked, unusually wet storm dump is now kind of normal, and what's extreme now is more. And that can have definite impact with the flooding and erosion and things like that. So if the rainfall comes in those strong spurts, that can lead to drought between the big events.
Okay, thank you. Question from James. Has anyone other than me noticed that we've had so many blue sky days now that 6,000 flights per day are grounded?
Yeah. There was a study about that. I'm trying to think of what it was. Certainly the emissions have gone down, but there was something about clarity of the air from reduced flights. I wouldn't think it would be that significant over us, but I think over urban areas, I'm not sure what that was. Maybe someone else remembers the story. It was relatively recently. There was some impact of the reduced.
I'm not sure of that. Interesting question from Frank. What do you think is the reason there has been no warming in the springtime? And actually, I wanted to add to that question. It looked like on your graph that you had, it said that in April, there were 2 degrees on that springtime graph. I don't know if you could go back to this, to your presentation.
That was May. May had the warming. Basically, February, March, and April in our analysis had no significant trend. It was bouncing up and down, but not going any particular direction. Then May started to pick up.
So do you have any explanation for that?
I think it's bizarre because you could maybe make a case and say, maybe it has to do with the transition from summer to winter, because, we're dominated by Arctic kind of air masses in the winter, and then you get more southerly air masses in the summer. So maybe the transition time, something's happening. Well, if it had to do with that sort of a mechanism, which came first to my mind, why isn't it happening in the fall? It's like all the change has been ripped out of the spring and put on the fall. So I don't know what that's all about. It's very strange. Maybe someone else has an explanation for it, but I have not heard of the mechanism for that. It's pretty common, I think, around a lot of the North America.
Okay, let's see, one more question. Beyond the successful community group you facilitated at the college, what larger steps can be taken to show the negative economic impacts to folks outside of the climate movement?
Yeah, well, first of all, you got to have your facts straight, right? You got to know what they are, because some things might not be impacted, right? Like I put that slide up there with the grapes, right? Okay, so April had the numeral 2 with no red bar. Okay, I got to relook at the chart there. But let's say that grape thing there in the Champlain Valley, right? So if you're a grape grower, you can maybe expect long-term to have it more favorable towards certain kinds of grapes. Whereas if you're an apple grower, maybe it's not so good, right? So what would you say is the impact on agriculture, right? Maybe there's no net effect, except for you personally, if you're an apple grower or a grape grower. So we've got to really understand the nitty-gritty of this. And again, this is why I was encouraging us to talk to people outside of our bubbles, because folks who, might not be interested in having a political argument might freely say, here's how my part of the Adirondacks works, and here's what I'd be concerned about, and here's what would happen if we changed it. So I think that's the first thing, is to really look at it and acknowledge also any positives. I mean, there have to be some, like the road salt thing, right? Or the grapes, and just be open about all of it, and then go from there, sticking to the facts.
Okay. I see a question actually that popped up over here in the chat box. And for those of you who are commenting in the chat, it looks like some of you are only posting to the panelists, not to the rest of the audience. You should be able to select that. Might be a little late in the evening to tell you that, but make sure that you select at the bottom of your screen, you're chatting, you want to comment to all panelists and attendees so others can see your comments.
And just to add to that, Elizabeth, if anyone's not looked at the chat box yet, people have posted a bunch of great information about different community science projects and stuff like that. So it's definitely worth, if you had questions on that, it's definitely worth scrolling through that chat box before we end the meeting tonight.
And we may also be able to post some of these links in a follow-up to the people who've attended. But an interesting question did pop up there from David Klein, says, how much does mown lawns versus meadows affect global warming?
Okay. Before we get to that, don't let me forget it. I did look at the chart. That's a typo on there. That 2 is supposed to be a 0. There's no bar.
Okay.
It should be a 0.
Okay.
So yes, the only real spring warming is May. So as far as the meadows go, that's very, very minimal effect on global warming, right? The gigantic effect is burning entire mountains full of coal and entire underground lakes of petroleum and giant seams of compressed natural gas, and then warming the planet and increasing the decay rates of things like peat deposits and tundra and lake sediments and bubbling even more out. So everything is swamped by that. However, there are tons of good reasons to have meadows. If you're not making a living growing a crop or that, to have it be as a meadow and instead of a mowed lawn, first of all, you're not, burning the fossil fuels with your lawnmower and putting horrible pesticides and things on it to keep it a monoculture of one kind of grass. You make habitat for critters and especially insects. There's a big concern that a lot of insects are in trouble as well from habitat loss and pesticide use. So, for example, here at our house here in Saranac Lake, we have a no-mow lawn, and we're letting everything come up, and it's just wonderful to sit in the summer and just sit in the grass, and it's waving over your head, and it's like it's moving, it's alive, right? And then you're surrounded by these really cool moths and crickets and all kinds of really neat wildlife with 6 legs, and the birds and other critters that come too. So there's tons of great reasons to do that. I think it's way more attractive having a meadow anyway.
Let's see, we do have a couple more comments and then it's about 10 past 8. So we'll probably try and wrap it up. I'll just read through some of these comments. Alice Halloran says, some local lake associations do citizen science. You could inquire with the Adirondack Lakes Alliance to find out about local lake associations. And I know that there are definitely some aquatic invasives monitoring that's done through the, I believe it's the Adirondack Watershed Alliance or Watershed Institute. And I might not be right about that, but you could inquire with them about how to monitor some things in specific lakes. I think some lake associations also have specific monitors. Curt, what else do you know about that one?
Yeah, it depends on the lake association. Some of them will hire someone to do the analyses, and others do it on their own. Here at Moody Pond, where I am, we just formed a lake association, and we're doing it on our own, but may hire someone. Someone actually, I saw a chat up there. They said, aren't there like sanctions against having no-mow lawns? That depends on your town. Some of you may know there was a giant controversy. Fog in my throat here. In Malone about that had to do with uninhabited houses and uncut lawns, and so there are regulations. You have to do it. We don't have that here in Saranac Lake, and a lot of us would be up in arms if someone tried to make that regulation. So you can be involved in what your town regulations are in that regard. I'm losing my voice. It's not COVID, and if it is, you can't catch us, so don't be afraid.
Let's see. Here's a question. Are winds becoming stronger with the changing climate of the North Country?
That is another thing I would love to know more about. Some airports and weather stations do record the wind. As far as I know, it's decreasing. In most places in North America, for some reason, it's called stilling. Where the wind speeds have decreased on average. And that really mystifies me, because as you warm the atmosphere, you're adding energy to the system. And so you would expect circulation to increase. What is going on with this stilling phenomenon? One of my students, former students, John Stetler, I don't know if he's in the group here or not, was working like in Crater Lake, Oregon. And they've got long-term data there. There's less wind. So it mixes less. That affects the temperature of the lake and the whole ecology of the lake too. So it is a phenomenon. I have seen some data from this general region, and if I remember correctly, it was also decreasing.
Interesting. Okay. I think there are a couple other comments that people have made in the questions and also in the chat. So I think we might wrap it up now. It looks like I do want to make a couple more announcements. There are a couple events coming up at the Grange. There is a watching together at home film on Saturday night, and on that's this coming weekend, I believe. And then on December 5th, there's an event we're going to try and do our holiday market, sort of outside, inside, and a grand opening for the Whitcomb's Garage, which is a great project right at the Grange site, right across the street from the Grange. Also, I wanted to ask the audience while we still have people, because I see people are dropping off. We are hoping to have another series in the winter, a Lyceum series. And if there are topics of interest, some of the things that you have put into the questions and into the chat this evening would make great topics. If you have a request for a topic you would like us to address, we would love for you to put those into the chat before you go tonight. And so that we can try and find speakers who would be interesting and engaging to try and tackle those topics or questions that you might have. So by all means, put those things in, and then I'll go back over and share some of the comments that were made in the question and answer as people are dropping out. Let's see. So Harriet Klein has a couple interesting quotes from National Geographic, one from April that says, "Pollution made the pandemic worse, but the lockdowns cleaned the skies." That looks like the title of an article. I'm not sure. And a second, that was from April 2020. And then a second one from "Can we keep clean skies after COVID-19 is over?" from August. So both of those I would refer you to. The second one was from Environment America. The first one was from National Geographic. And Frank makes a comment that great places to donate to are iNaturalist, Earthsea Society, Protecting All Invertebrates, your local cooperative extension, and Bumblebee Watch. All of those are contributing in some way to data collection or to protection of species threatened by climate change. Let's see, lots of ideas going through, and lots of thanks to you, Curt. I do really appreciate how much time that you spent and continue to spend capturing the local information and keeping us local and putting that information in our hands so that we can make choices that will enable us to be a positive force for change. I will swing back around to where we started this evening. The Youth Climate Program from the Wild Center did host this incredible event simultaneously while we were talking here. And I'm hoping that they recorded it because there are some really, really powerful young people who are actively working on climate justice and the way that these climate changes are going to affect rural communities, people of color, people of low income. And so I want to just really give a shout out to that group and to the speakers at that presentation tonight. And it's possible that maybe we could get one of them to come to follow up on Curt's presentation tonight. So with that, I guess, I think it's time to wrap up. Does that sound right?
Well, thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much,
thanks
Curt.
again for organizing this wonderful series.
Thanks
Thank
again,
you.
Curt. Appreciate it.
On a positive note, we did get some seasonally appropriate snowflakes here in Westport today. So take care all, and be safe, and look for us again from the comfort of your couch in the winter.
All right.
Great. Thanks all.
Take care now, folks.